Okay, hello everyone. I'm continuing my Tuesday talks on Pirkei Avot, as it is customary in the summer to go through this, and since we can't meet on Shabbat, it's a good time to do it. Last time I talked, I finished Mishnah 1, and now I am Mishnah 2 of chapter 1. And as I said, that something very unusual about chapter 1 is that it's really dealing with one of the themes that I said Pirkei Avot is talking about. There are really two themes. These are the two themes that come before and after the study of Pirkei Avot. And these are the two themes which really were the, I would say, the main issues between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Prushim and the Stukim. One has to do with the authenticity of the oral tradition, and the second one has to do with the place of the world to come. And because, of course, the Sadducees did not believe neither in the world to come or in the authenticity of the oral tradition, so these two elements then, which are a bone of contention between these groups, become major themes in Pirkei Avot. And the whole first chapter of Pirkei Avot is really talking about the transmission of the oral tradition, not only Mishnah 1 of Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai Masorah Yeshua, Moses who received the Torah from Sinai and gave it to Joshua, etc., but really the whole first chapter leading up to chapter 2, which starts with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Rebbe, as he is referred to, who is the redactor, the editor of the Mishnah. We also have to remember that the Mishnah itself, and Pirkei Avot is part of the Mishnah in Nezikin at the end, the Mishnah itself, the narrative of the Mishnah, even though it's a collection of Tanaic scholars from a period of anywhere between 200 to 300 years, most of them within 200 years of the writing of the Mishnah, some of them 300 years, and today's name, Shimon Hatzadik, is 400 years before, maybe even more than that, 450 years before the writing of the Mishnah. So before the editing, I would call it, of the Mishnah. So we don't have a lot of names from that time. Basically, what you have to understand is the narrative of the Mishnah, therefore, are people who are writing in the second century, more or less, or editing it in the second century and looking back. As the Talmud says, that Stam Mishnah Rabbi Meir, a regular Mishnah which has no name, is following the opinion of Rabbi Meir, V'kula Aliba de Rabbi Akiva, and all the Mishnayot follow the academy of Rabbi Akiva, which is in the second century. And then, of course, by the end of the second century, the Mishnah is edited by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, somewhere around the year 200. Now, so reflecting back, we have to understand that the whole first chapter here is a reflection back of where we came from. Another important document, which has to be understood in addition to the first chapter of the Mishnah Pirkei Avot, of course, is the famous Igeret, the epistle of Shrira Gaon. Shrira Gaon, a Babylonian Gaon writing in the 8th century, in his treatise called, his letter really, the letter of Shrira Gaon, describes the transmission of the oral tradition up until his day, and he starts in the same way, in the sense of Pirkei Avot, going back from the beginning, who were the Tanaic scholars, who were the Amoraic scholars, etc. However, the difference is that Pirkei Avot is not just about history. It's like in general in rabbinic thinking, there is history and there's meta-history. There's a way of looking at history. And that's why, even if the names are more or less correct, the dates might be a little bit sometimes played around with, sometimes just because the traditions are not clear, and sometimes because there are statements that want to be made. So let's understand who the Shimon Hatzadik is. So the Mishnah says Shimon Hatzadik was the leftover of the Knesset Hagdolah. We mentioned last time the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the men of the Great Assembly. This is the forerunner of the Sanhedrin of the High Court in Jerusalem, which either had 120 members according to the Talmud Bavli or 85 members according to the Yerushalmi. And the Bavli says that there were 3 prophets among them. The Yerushalmi says there were 30 prophets among them. But you have here this transition period, therefore, between what I refer to as the as the prophetic period. That represents the prophets within this Anshe Knesset Agdolah, and the post-prophetic period, which is called Chokhmah, which is wisdom, as I talked about last time. We're still in this period. We are going from prophecy to wisdom. And Shimon Hatzadik is exactly an image like that. Now, who is Simon the Just? Who is Shimon Hatzadik? Historically, that's a problem because really there are 2 Simon the Just. One of them is Simon the First, lives anywhere between 310 to minus 229, meaning before 291 before the Common Era, or 310 to 273. Again, the dates are not clear. He's the son of Onias the First, Chonyo, and the grandson of Yadua. So that's the first Simon the Righteous, and this seems to be the Simon the Righteous according to Josephus Flavius. This Simon the Righteous lives, of course, he was born in 310, before the Common Era, and the Talmud actually claims that when Alexander the Great, of course this would be a little bit difficult historically, because even if it's Simon the First, Alexander the Great comes to Jerusalem in around 332 before the Common Era, which was before he was born. But anyhow, the story is that Alexander the Great conquers, of course, the whole world in the Middle East too, and comes to Jerusalem. According to some versions of the story, the Kutim want to convince him to destroy the temple that was built by Ezra and Nehemiah, and Simon the Just comes out, Shimon Hatzadik, dressed in the garments of the high priest, because he was the high priest of the temple. Remember, in the Second Temple period, the priests are running basically Jerusalem. And he comes out with flowing white garments, and according to the story told in the Talmud, Alexander bows down to him. And when he's asked why is he bowing down to this person, he said, because I saw him in a dream every time I was victorious in war. He was the image that I saw. So again, you have this idea of Simon the Just being, this story, in my opinion, has 2 meanings behind it. Number one, he's still somebody who has these spiritual powers. He can appear in dreams. There are other stories about Simon the Just of having unusual powers. For instance, seeing a sign that it was going to be his last year in the temple as he walks into the temple, etc. So he, again, as I said, the transition between prophecy and scholarship. Another thing about Simon the Just, according to the story, it's also the transition between the Persian period and the Greek. Simon the Just, according to this, is the beginning of the Greek period. Remember, the Greeks, as I said, conquered the area in 332 before the Common Era. After Alexander dies, our area becomes part of the Seleucid Empire. So we're now right at the beginning of the Seleucid Empire with Simon the Just. I feel that Simon the Just is the grandson of the one who I just mentioned, who is Simon II, who lives from 219 before the Common Era to 199 before the Common Era. Of course, it might be probably more than that, because that's a little amount of time. Of course, it says about the first Simon the Just that he was high priest for 40 years, and this one for 20 years. That probably what it means is probably not about how long he lived. It's very hard to know how long these people lived. It's easier to know how long they were in the temple. And there's arguments between the scholars, Frankel and Gretz and Moore and Zeitlin and Lowy and Weiss. This is a problem that we won't solve in this little talk. But assuming that Simon the Just is Simon the Second, it's just a little bit easier, and why his student becomes Antigonos Ish Socho makes it a little bit easier with the dates. In any event, though, Simon the Just is this transition between the Persian governments and now the Greek Seleucid government, which takes over this area. That's why, by the way, his student Antigonos has, of course, the name of a Greek king. Now, it says that he's Mishayarei, from the leftovers of the men of the Great Assembly. Why is this important to say? Because it's the concept of the transition. Now it says, he used to say, Al Shlosha Dvarim Ha'olam Omed, the world stands on three things. Which world? The Jewish world? The world at large? What world are we referring to? What are the three things? These three things, of course, are Al HaTorah, on Torah, Al HaAvodah, which means work or the service, either the service of God or work. Ve'al Gemilut Chasadim, and on acts of kindness. Now, what are these three things? Of course, Torah is probably the study of Torah. Avodah. Some people try to explain that Avodah is work. So that would be the world, at least the Jewish world, is built on a life of Torah, toiling because we're part of the natural world, and doing good deeds. But according to that, then, are good deeds something different from the Torah? Or, when we say Torah, do we mean the study of the Torah, and then good deeds would include all of the mitzvot? Then, of course, a second possibility would be that Torah is actually the study of Torah. Avodah is the service of the temple, which would make sense because Simon the Just was a high priest, and in temple times. And then Gemilut Chasadim, of course, is doing acts of kindness, which include the mitzvot, because the mitzvot are basically acts of kindness. If you remember the story, the Talmud in Shabbat tells a story about a potential convert who came to Hillel the elder, Hillel HaZaken, who lived in the 1st century of the Common Era. And he came to Shammai, the colleague of Hillel. Both of them were the heads of the Sanhedrin. One was the president and one was the head of the Beit Din. So he said to Shammai, teach me the whole Torah while I am standing on one foot. Shammai thought that was a ridiculous thing to say. He thought he was just making fun of him, and he cast him away. But then he came to Hillel. He said, teach me the whole Torah while I'm standing on one foot. Hillel said, not a problem. The whole Torah is, do not do to others what you would not want others to do to you. That is the major principle. Everything else, just details. Now go learn the details. So basically for Hillel, by the way, that's the negative of the positive. The positive version, as mentioned in Leviticus, Vayikra chapter 19, is you shall love your neighbor as yourself. In the negative form, the way it's made in the Talmud is, do not do to others which you would not want others to do to you. So basically, he says that's the basic principle. Once you already have a sensitivity to the basic principle, everything else is easy. It all falls in line. So first understand the basic principle of everything. So the Torah then, or the world, which is an interesting thing, who's the Torah, who's the world, is based on the study of Torah, the service of the temple, and doing good deeds. Now what does that mean? When we study Torah, we are listening to the voice of God. Remember at Sinai, the Torah says, Kol gadol v'lo yasaf, a great thundering voice that never stopped. It continues in every generation. Lo yasaf from the word sof, it never stops. For those who listen carefully, they can hear it in the words of the Torah. But that's only, as Chaim Volozhin would say, when you study Torah lishma, when you try to study Torah for its sake. And then you're clinging to the giver of the Torah through the Torah. Because of the words of the Torah, the words of God. So by clinging through these words, we are clinging to the giver of the Torah. So in the Torah, God is speaking to us. First of all, in general, how to live our lives and the general principles. But in a sense, God is actually speaking to us in every generation because it's our reception of the Torah, our receiving of the Torah from Sinai, which happens during our lifetime as we are studying the Torah. We are now receiving that Torah that was given then in our generation now. That's the study of Torah. Kol gadol v'lo yasaf, a thundering voice which never stopped. And this is called the study of Torah. So when we study Torah, God is speaking to us. In the worship of the temple, just like in tefillah, in prayer, we are trying to connect to God. So if the Torah is initiated by God, the service of the temple and later prayer, which takes the place of the service of the temple, is initiated by us, where we want to make this connection now to God. So there's an up to down relationship, which is called Torah, and a down to up relationship, which is called the service of the temple or prayer. And then there's a lateral relationship, which is called doing good deeds between man and mankind, because that's why we're placed on this earth. Not only our relationship to God, a relationship to human beings. We have to find grace and good common sense in the eyes of God and the eyes of man. So this is the main reason why we are in this world, to somehow break out of the 4 cubits of our egocentricity and realize that there is what to do in this world. You see, God creates a universe which is not perfect, and He puts human beings in this universe who are also not perfect. But we have the ability to perfect this imperfect world, and by doing this, it actually perfects our chesronot, our shortcomings. My father used to tell a story about a certain individual who was going through major depression. I'm not going to say clinical depression, but depression. And he called him up and he said, I can't go on any longer. It's just, things are hitting me too much. I can't deal with it anymore. I'm losing my job. I'm losing my friends. I'm losing my family. I don't want to burden anybody anymore. It's too much. So my father says in the story, he says, give me a chance to talk to you, okay? He says, okay. He says, when can we meet? Can we meet tomorrow around 2 o'clock? 2 o'clock, yeah. I have all the time in the world, I guess. So they meet around 2 o'clock. And they go to this home for disabled children. And the head of the home is showing them around. And they come and they're watching this boy who has only one leg and how he's trying to walk. And this fellow is looking in wonder, like, can he actually do this? And he watches the boy and he watches the determination on his face, what he's trying to do with one real leg and one fake leg. And after the boy is able to do 4 steps, the smile on his face, he can't believe it. Walk into another room and they see their children and with learning disabilities. And one of them is trying to learn how to read. And the teacher is sitting there with great patience. And they're trying to figure out a word. Mo, te, ha, And for this is going on for a while. Finally, the child looks up at the teacher with a big smile and says, "Mother." She says, "That's right. That's what it is." And it's like the smile never disappeared. They walk into another room and there's a swimming pool. And they're watching crippled children swimming in the pool, making up for their losses. And finally the man turns to my father and says, "This is amazing. What can I do to help these kids?" He says, "Help these kids? I thought you're not going to be here tomorrow. Wasn't that the plan? Just forget about that. This is really important. Let's not play this down. This is really important." When we find purpose in life, that makes us better people. So God created a universe which is purposely not perfect. But he knew that we, the non-perfect beings, have the ability to perfect it. It's really up to our free will to do this. We can conquer all because this is the way the world was programmed. It has problems, and we were programmed to fix those problems. So if those problems are not getting fixed, we have to wonder what we are doing wrong. So, Simon the Just, Shimon Hatzadik, the world stands on three things. On Torah, the relationship between God and man. On the service of the temple or prayer, the relationship between man and God. And doing good deeds. And all the mitzvot about doing good deeds. As Rabbi Kook says, there are two levels for the mitzvot. What we call Musar Hativi, the natural level of morality, which are the mitzvot we can understand, not to kill, not to murder, not to steal. But then there are mitzvot which have certain sensitivities that you have to develop to understand them, because they're not self-evident. Shabbat, kosher, you can try to look into it and try to perceive it, but they're not self-evident. They take time to understand it. But all this has to do with acts of kindness, whether to the world or even to yourself. Being nice to yourself can also be an act of kindness. There's a story about the Chafetz Chaim, Israel Meir HaKohen, who died in 1935 and wrote a famous commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, called the Mishnah Brura. He also wrote a book on gossip, on not to say bad things, and that's why he was called the Chafetz Chaim, who wants life, because that was the name of his book. And one time he used to sell copies of his book, the Mishnah Brura, both to publicize the book and for a living. One day he came across somebody, and he showed him the book, and the man said, "Mishnah Brura? This is the book of the famous Chafetz Chaim, that great righteous saint and scholar. Unbelievable. I'd love to buy the book." Chafetz Chaim was slightly embarrassed. The man called him such a saint and scholar without knowing who he was. So embarrassed, he said to himself, "Okay, I'm sure he was a scholar and a saint, but let's not overdo it." The man was so taken back that what this man said about the Chafetz Chaim, he says, "How dare you say about the Chafetz Chaim he wasn't the greatest saint and scholar?" And he smacked him on the face. After that story, Israel Meir HaKohen said to himself, "Now I realize you're not allowed to say gossip even about yourself. You can't even say bad things about yourself. Forget about others." So, sometimes we have to do nice things to ourselves too, because we're also people, and to others. So the world is based on three things. Now, the Maharal, Rabbi Lev of Prague, again tries to create a formula. And he looks for a formula, what are these three things? And he founds this in the images of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is already a Talmudic idea. The Talmud says anybody who is descended, anybody who is merciful, kind, and baishan, which means humble or timid, must be a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And if not, or they say in the negative, you cannot be a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob if you're not merciful, kind, and bashful. Kindness is called Abraham. As it says in Micah, give kindness to Abraham, give truth to Jacob and kindness to Abraham. Titen emet liYaakov chesed l'Avraham shenishbata lavotenu mimiked. Also in Kabbalistic literature. And bashfulness is from Isaac, who was a very insular person after the story of the Akedah. And mercy is called the attribute of Jacob. So as descendants of these three, one of the characteristics of being Jewish is to be merciful, kind, and bashful. Does that mean everybody's like that? Hopefully, to a certain extent. Now, actually, the book of Kings says that in the middle of a war, somebody came to give himself in to the soldiers of Israel because he heard the soldiers of Israel were merciful, which is very true about us even today, which is something I think which the nations have difficulty understanding. So the Maharal says then that these three attributes represents the three forefathers. Gimilut chasadim, acts of kindness, that's Abraham. He says avodah, which is the service of the temple, is represented by Isaac, who was brought as a sacrifice, as an offering by his father in the Akedah, in the binding of Isaac. And even if this offering never went through, he was really ready, and it influenced the rest of his life. This probably traumatic event. And Torah is represented by Jacob, because it says he's Yoshev Ohalim, he dwelled in the tents. And the Mishnah says that he dwelled in the tents, in the yeshiva, in the study academy of Shem and Aver, of Shem, the son of Noah, and Aver, the descendant, of Noah, the great-great-grandfather of Abraham, but the descendant of Shem and Aver. So, in Midrashic thinking, Yaakov represents Torah, and and definitely Abraham represents kindness, and the Maharal adds that Isaac represents the service of the temple. So we have these three, again we have a formula to understanding what this is supposed to mean. But I think this formula also says something else. You see, our forefathers are our forefathers not only for us, but also for the whole world. Not the whole world, but a large amount, because Abraham is called the father of many nations, Av Hamon Goyim. And Ishmael was not Jewish, and neither was Esau. It's the children of Jacob who become the children of Israel. So the three fathers really represent many nations, Semitic nations, and even non-Semitic nations, because Esau, for some strange reason, has an association through the Midrash with a lot of the Western nations from the time of Christianity on. But Abraham becomes Av Hamon Goyim, the father of many nations. Even nations in the East, according to the understanding of the Midrash, of the children of Keturah, who went off to the East. Because of this, then, what happens within the Jewish people, as Rabbi Kook writes in the beginning of his book, Orot, what happens with the Jewish people is reflected in the world like a mirror. What we do affects the world, what the world does affects us. Everything is reflected one to another. We're a microcosmos of what's happening in the world. Therefore, if you see anti-Semitism in the world, it's not a problem of the Jewish people, it's a problem of the world. It means we're not there yet. When we will be there, it'll be eradicated. But it shows that there is still an anti-Semitic virus in the world. When we get over it, there will be happiness in the world. But we have to get over it together with the nations of the world. We have to work on it together. There are issues, of course, within the Jewish people we have to work on ourselves. Possibly if we were on a better level and a better paradigm, it would reflect better. I'm not saying we're any worse than any other nation, but I'm just saying there's always what to improve. And the more that we get our paradigm right, I think it'll have a better effect. And the nations, as I said, it's a reflection of what's going on in the world. So that's why Shimon Hatzadik can say that the world stands on these three things. Because what happens with the Jewish people, as the maestro of the orchestra, which is the nations of the universe, is something which happens within us and the world at large. So, if the world is based on three things, so are the Jewish people. The connection between God to man, which is the Torah, the connection between man to God, which is the prayers and the service of the temple, this relationship to try striving towards godliness in this world, and of course acts of kindness, which are the reason why we're here to perfect our world. And next week we'll talk about the student of Shimon Hatzadik, Antigonos Ish Socho, which we'll talk about not only the oral tradition and the tradition of the Torah, but the second aspect of the controversy between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Shalom, shalom.